Well, to debate this, we're joined now by former Kremlin advisor and political commentator Alexander Nekrasov in London. And in Kiev, we have Peter Zalmayev. He's the director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative, an organization that promotes democracy and human rights in post-communist societies. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Mr. Nekrasov, this JIT report seems conclusive enough, and we've had strong responses from the Australian and Dutch leadership. It seems a slam dunk case. This came from the very top. Russia shot down MH17 and is responsible for the deaths of almost 300 people, including 80 children, right?
Well, I'm sorry, but there's absolutely no new evidence about this report. And I'm sorry to say that everything they said has already been said. Now, I find it perverse that the so-called evidence is provided by this strange website, Bellingcat, which collects rumors on social media and then produces it as fact. I mean, this really has to stop. These sort of accusations are absolutely foundless. You can't really conduct policy like that. The issue of this matter is that an armed coup, which was encouraged, financed, organized, and supported by the West, took place in Ukraine. An illegal regime took over power in Kiev. And I'm sorry, that illegal regime could not even conduct proper talks with its own people and waged a war against them, accusing them without any proof of being agents of Russia.
Everything you've said, certainly. No, these are interesting points.
Let me finish.
No, you make interesting points, but everything you said doesn't mean that... Everything you said still doesn't mean that Russia couldn't have shot down that plane, right? They could be an illegal regime, it could have been a coup. Go ahead.
No, you didn't let me finish.
Okay, finish.
So, the problem was that a passenger plane should not have been allowed by Ukrainian authorities to fly over a conflict zone which was used, where all sides, including army units of Ukraine and all these so-called separatists and also these terrorists who posed as Ukrainian supporters, used all sorts of weapons. The guilt is with the Ukrainian government. The Ukrainian government has to provide safe routes for aircraft, passenger aircraft, over its territory. Now to start suddenly to blame rebels and then not rebels, but army units from Russia, this is absurd.
Okay, let's get Mr. Zalmayev.
There is no proof.
Okay.
None.
Okay. Peter Zalmayev, in addition to what you heard from Alexander Nekrasov, let me quote to you what the Russian Defense Ministry recently said in response to the JIT investigation. They said not a single anti-aircraft missile system from the Russian Federation has ever crossed the Russia-Ukraine border. Okay, so absorb those two things. Tell me your response. Does any of that check out for you?
Well, I'll just have to say that from the very beginning, from the very first days of this catastrophe, the Russian side put out this massive propaganda flood of disinformation, which actually was a watershed moment in as much as this was actually one of the first such instances when massive disinformation was used as part of Russia's hybrid warfare, not only against Ukraine, but also what we've seen in the last several years in elections in various Western countries, including the United States. The matter as it stands is such that a very thorough 4-year-long investigation by several parties, including the Dutch side and the Australians and the Ukrainians, finally, after painstaking labor, was able to corroborate a lot of the findings, if not all of the findings that were, in fact, reached by the open source investigative service Bellingcat. It took 4 years, and the parties involved were not interested parties. Contrary to what the Russian side is saying, I cannot blame either the Australians or the Dutch of being in the pocket of the Americans. These are countries that actually want to have normal trade relations with Russia, and what they go by is the evidence evidence of the fact. What we have heard from the Russians and what we're continuing to hear, including from our fellow guest, from Mr. Nekrasov, is the question of where are the facts. It seems like anything short of showing them a photo of Vladimir Putin pushing the button of that missile launcher, they will never be satisfied by any sort of fact.
Okay, so let's ask Mr. Nekrasov. Mr. Nekrasov, is that the case? That you're just poisoning the well here. There's no amount of evidence that you can accept. There is nothing that will be able to prove to you that Russia did this. Is that true?
Well, first of all, I didn't see any evidence at all. And let me make one point, which is probably very timely today. Yesterday, we saw a coup in Italy pulled off by the EU when an elected government, properly democratically elected government, was simply thrown away and so on. Now, that's what the EU countries do. They do these strange interferences all over the EU and outside.
But what does it have to do with a plane being shot down out of the sky, sir?
Oh,
please. Tell me.
That has a lot to do with it, because these coups create tensions in these countries. This coup create a civil war where groups out from, I mean, God knows where, with arms which were held on Ukrainian territory, including, by the way, anti-aircraft missiles, was suddenly brought to this territory around eastern Ukraine. So please don't say that this coup had nothing to do with the civil war
so let me then
and
ask
the
you,
tragedies that started to unravel.
Okay, so is it still plausible?
Don't make the EU
is it still plausible then, because you hold the
organization?
Right, you hold the Ukrainian government responsible. You say they create a state of chaos and they're responsible for even allowing the aircraft to go through a conflict zone. So that doesn't rule out the fact that it's still plausible, in your opinion, that Russia could have shot it down, right? Because it was a conflict zone. So is that still plausible?
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. Let me tell you why I said that the Ukrainian government is responsible, because the plane was flying over its territory, over its country's territory. It was controlled by the Ukrainian land control, dispatchers, by the Ukrainian crews from the ground. You cannot blame Russians for these people guiding the planes over Ukraine. This is why they're trying to pin this blame on Russia. They know they are to blame. They know their terrorists were using all sorts of military equipment over there from the Soviet days, actually. They knew that they were to blame, and they had to pin it on Russia because they didn't want to be held responsible. And that is why we see this saga continuing and continuing. Right. And I can tell you another thing. The EU should not be presented as a peaceful organization. It is now like a second NATO. It brought Europe on the brink of World War III 3 times now in a row.
Although, just as a reminder, the JIT is comprised of Australia, Belgium, Malaysia, the Netherlands, and Ukraine. The majority of those countries in the JIT, not EU members. Peter Zalmayev, I'm guessing you want accountability. Those countries also calling for accountability. They want Russia to be held to account. How can it actually be held to account if at the UN Security Council it holds veto power? I don't know. Is it going to go through the international courts? Is it going to be bilaterally? How would you like to see accountability? Tell me, Peter.
Well, I think the likeliest and most logical outcome of this, and the next step in this process, is actually turning over all the evidence which the Dutch investigators said will stand in any court of law, and turning this evidence into the International Court of Justice in The Hague. We're talking about lawsuits by these governments, these countries that you mentioned, Malaysia, Australia, or Holland. And we're also talking about a class action lawsuit by the families of these victims. Okay, I'm going to wrap. Gentlemen, it's been good to chat to both of you. I hope to have you both on the program in the not-too-distant future. Alexander Nekrasov and Peter Zalmayev, thanks so much.